let's start from the very beginning, because I really want you to have a complete understanding of every move and every idea of this opening, instead of just relying on memorizing of various opening variations, which is really hard, actually. It's much better to understand the logic, to understand why certain moves are considered to be main, why they're considered to be natural, proper, and why masters do play them. Alright, so if you're a more advanced level player, then some of these ideas are already familiar to you. If you're a more beginner level player, then this will be precious, but either way, we're going to fill in the gaps so that you have the complete all-around knowledge of this opening. Right, let's start from the very, very beginning. What is the goal of an opening? It is to develop your pieces, such as your knight's, bishop's, castle, and to control the center of the board, the middle of the board. How do you do that? Well, in order to achieve that goal, usually the first move is going to be either e4 or d4, because that's how you actually start controlling the center right away. And if we take a look at the move d4, which is clearly one of the oldest and most well-known chess openings, here there is a little advantage of d4 compared to e4. From here, the d4 pawn is already defended by the queen, so he can never blunder it, and for that reason, the queen's gambit is a more solid, more risk-free opening. And more positional players usually love playing this. Now, after a d4, ideally speaking, white would love to take the center fully by playing pawn e4 on the next move. Let's say if black plays some random move, we're going to play e4. And now just look at how many squares white starts controlling now. White took the center, which gave white also a lot of squares, additionally, which they control to. Also, by moving the pawns forward, we gave some more breathing space for the pieces standing behind them, and now they also started to be involved, even from their original squares. And now I've just marked all the squares that white pieces are controlling, and you see that is pretty much the entire board. And white achieved that within just 2 moves, so that's the power of taking the center. And for that reason, normally black does not want to let white accomplish their plan, and they're going to counteract white in their attempt to play pawn a4. And for that reason, black has 2 main options. It's either to play the move d5, so that the pawn takes control of this square, or to bring their knight to f6, and then the knight will take control of that square. So these are the 2 main moves of black, either d5 or knight f6. And d5 is known for over 500 centuries, so I gotta say 500 years. And is known as the queen's gambit after the white's move pawn c4. But once again, what's the point? Why should white play this move pawn c4? White not to just develop simply, not a free knight c3, stuff like that. Well, if you develop, there is nothing wrong with that, but you don't get any advantages. Black will develop just as well, right? So how do you get an advantage again? Let's look back at our first idea that you also need to fight for the center. How do you do that? Now, we have currently completely equal station in the center. How do you do that? Well, in order to challenge black in the center, maybe white can try playing knight c3 followed by e4. And if white could accomplish that, they would indeed get greater influence over central squares. But the problem here is that black can counteract this very easily just by playing a somewhat symmetric move knight f6, and they're also providing one more defense to this square. If black ever needs to, they can also play, bishop f5 and control that way. And so, although white wants to play e4, they can't really achieve that. And so knight c3 does not really bring the result that white is hoping for, which brought white to think about, okay, let's try to undermine black's center from the other side by playing c4 and taking the center that way. And that starts the queen's gambit, as we are a gambit in the pawn. In fact, black can't retain that pawn anyway, so it's not really a gambit. Again, d4 is a more classical, more solid, risk-free opening. So you're not even sacrificing the pawn, really. You're sacrificing it just for a moment, for a move or 2, because you're going to get it back. And now let's see at black's options. White's idea is pretty clear. I want to eliminate this pawn, which will give you an advantage in the center. So that's the reason behind move pawn c4. What can black do now? We'll start from some popular options, although not the most popular ones, and then we'll gradually climb to the main lines of the queen's gambit. So there are a couple interesting things here, and the first question, of course, is why not to just take this pawn and get a pawn advantage? What's going to happen in that case? Some interesting things start happening right here, just after these 2 moves played. It's white to move currently. I've opened the database of games, and here in the corner we can see the statistics of moves played. The most played move is at the top. And as you can see here, most amateurs play knight c3. This move is by far the most popular, and it's actually wrong. So what's wrong with the move which amateurs play, knight c3? Well, the problem with this move, although it's standard general speaking, it just looks like a normal development move, but in the given context of the Queen's Gambit accepted, it allows black in different variations to counter a strike in the center with the move pawn e5. Let's not forget that currently black is a pawn up, thanks to them capturing pawn on c4 in the previous move, so they might be willing to give up a pawn back, but to gain quick development and some initiative and to start attacking right away, start challenging white. Now they threaten to capture this pawn, and if white said, okay, let me just take it, then black can trade queens, pushing white's knight back. And as you look at this position, let's say after a knight to c6, although it's more or less equal, it's actually more pleasant for black. Black is attacking this pawn, the bishops can be developed very easily, black can castle queenside. So somewhat it's black who has the initiative here, and now white needs to be careful and find proper defensive move, and now rather white fights for the equality, which is now what you want to do when you're playing white, you want to have an advantage. So that's really not what white wants, so let's take these moves back. And for that reason, the move knight c3 is kind of wrong. It's not a terrible disaster, of course, but it's kind of wrong. It allows this counter-strike with the move pawn e5, which challenges white's center here. Alright, so after e5, as we can see, the most played move here by white is pawn d5. White does not want to engage in diversion, and so they play pawn d5, which can start a very common trap, which I'm about to share with you. Now, black goes knight f6 here, the most played move. White goes pawn e4. Makes sense, white wants to regain the pawn here on c4. And just look at this, the most played move by black is bishop b4, which is actually a blunder, but it's worth knowing it, because as you can see, a lot of your opponents will play it. Because after a bishop b4, it's a good-looking move. It pins the knight, threatens to capture this pawn. Looks really great for black, and it's all true besides one tactical drawback. White can play queen e4, which is double attack to the king and the bishop. So on the next move, white is going to simply pick up the bishop and win the game right away. However, if you don't want to engage in those complex variations, the easiest thing you can do is just to take this pawn back as soon as you can by playing pawn e3, preparing to capture this pawn right on the next move. And black usually should give up this pawn and allow you capture it on the next move, because if black tries to hold on to this pawn by playing pawn d5, and you'll be astonished to see that it's the second most played move in this position with, if I'm not mistaken, 200,000 people playing this. So although it's an old trap, a lot of players still fall right into it. And the problem here is, although it defends this pawn, I can undermine this whole pawn structure, and black cannot defend it. If black takes here, that just breaks up all the pawns, and you can pick them up easily. So that does not help black, definitely, to keep their pawn advantage. If black tries pawn a6, that fails to another tactics here. After pawn a6, we can just capture here and take advantage of this pin. Therefore, black cannot recapture, or else they would lose the rook on a8, which is pretty cool. And finally, if your opponent calculates this line that pawn a6 doesn't work, here you may come to the conclusion that they may defend this pawn just by playing pawn c6. And now, after an exchange, looks like black maintained their mature advantage. Everything's cool. And it's all right besides the fact that after a queen f3, you're hitting this rook and there is no way for the rook to escape. And that's the trap that you can still use very effectively against lots of your opponents. Here you get the decisive mature advantage as early as move 6. Now it's time to show you something interesting once again. So I've opened the database of games, and here we can see that the move which is fairly close to pawn takes c4, which is actually a good move for black, one of the good options, but the other one, with almost 4 million people playing it, is knight f6, which is actually wrong. It's just an error that allows whites to gain an opening advantage. But funnily enough, most players don't know how to take advantage of this, and they still play the move knight c3. Somehow the stereo of knight c3 appears to always be wrong in these different variations. I don't know why. The correct move for white is pawn takes d5. That's how white gets the advantage. That's why I wanted to show this quite interesting stats that, again, most people don't know how to take advantage of this mistake of knight f6. They just play knight c3, which transposes back into main lines. But instead, you can take advantage of this fact, and you can actually accomplish your plan and eliminate black's pawn from the center completely. And whatever black does here, you can get a quite noticeable advantage. For example, if knight takes d5, you just play pawn e4, and you achieved your ideal goal. You achieved this beautiful pawn center, and you even gained some extra tempo by taking this knight. So that's cool. Now, let's take this back. Let's say black captures here on d5 with their queen instead of the knight. Well, that doesn't change things too much. Now you play knight c3. Now is finally the right time to play this. And it hits the queen, and as the queen moves back somewhere, but say in most cases they go queen d8 just back, then you still play pawn e4. here or on the next move, and it once again gives you this beautiful pawn center, and black usually plays some strange moves, e6, bishop g4, but either way you're getting already a significant positional advantage. Anytime in the future you're ready to push forward with e5, of course you don't have to do this, but you have this threat available anytime you want, or you're just gonna simply develop normally and have a very comfortable game. Okay, now we're approaching the main lines of the Queen's Gambit. So the main line here is the move pawn a6. We already know that, ideally speaking, black wants to maintain their presence in the center, so they don't want to give up their center. And now the question is, how do you defend that pawn? And you can do that in two different ways. It's either playing c6, the slam defense, or playing e6, instead of that, which is the Queen's Gambit. Now, if you play, both moves have certain drawbacks, although they both are perfectly good and perfectly playable. When black goes pawn c6, that does defend this pawn, but takes away the normal square of c6 from black's knight, and that's a drawback. In contrast to this, when black goes pawn e6, Garry defends the pawn nice, that blocks out the side score bishop, so it cannot be developed anymore and is a little bit passive. That's a drawback of this move, but again, that said, both moves are perfectly fine. What does white usually do after that? Well, simply develop. Actually, you don't even need to know too much theory here, you just develop. So you play knight c3, for example, knight f6, and after that just bishop g5, pawn e3. White needs to play e3 in order to bring this bishop out from f1, but before playing e3, it's better to bring this bishop out, because let's take this move back. If you play e3 right away, then yes, you does develop this one, but the bishop on the c1 is kind of locked, it can't get out. So for that reason, instead of e3 right away, it's better to bring the bishop out first and only then play e3 and you just develop. After that, black usually goes bishop e7 to neutralize this pain, and then again white just develops. Knight f3, castles, pawn e3, just bishop d3, castling. White simply plays most natural developing moves, and that is it. So that is the most classical variation of the Queen's Gambit. That said, if you do not want to study any opening theory and you want to keep it simple for you, there is a way to simplify matters. If you want to keep it simple and still, which is a completely perfect and fine variation for white, you can trade here in the center so that you never have to worry about this potential tension or black capturing your pawn here on c4. You can simply exchange. And after that, you do pretty much the same. You just develop your pieces. You play knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, and after that you develop the rest of your army. That's it. By the way, there is one nasty trap you gotta be aware of. Some of your opponents will definitely try to pull it off against you. That's a move knight to d7. Seems like black overlooked that due to this ping, you can now capture this pawn on d5 freely by playing knight takes d5. At first look like you trick black, but instead they counter-trick you by playing knight takes d5, temporarily sacrificing their queen, because after the counter-strike bishop b4, suddenly it turns out that there is no other way to cover your king but to play queen d2 and give the queen back. And after this exchange, after we capture everything available, we can see that at the end black has an extra minor piece, an extra knight, and that's how black achieves a winning game. By the way, I've got another video with the top 5 opening traps in the Queen's Gambit, so if you're interested, you can click the link and check it after watching this one. And now let's come back a little bit. Of course, you just don't need to get into this trap. So let's come back right before the trap. Instead of taking this pawn, which you shouldn't do, you just develop, as usual, e3, bishop d3, knight f3, castle, and things are good. There is also one common error from black that you gotta be aware of so that you know how to take advantage of it. In positions like this, the usual response of black is bishop e7, and here at some point your opponent may decide to develop his bishop's light score bishop somewhere, maybe to f5 or maybe to g4. And that usually is wrong if done too early in the game. If your opponent tries playing bishop f5, looks like a perfectly great option to control this diagonal, there is a major drawback. It weakens this pawn on b7, and you can take advantage of that by playing queen b3, which targets these two weak pawns of black. And actually can win the pawn right away. You just need to eliminate the defender of this pawn first, so in order to remove this knight, which defends the pawn, you can simply trade it first, and after that you play this common move queen b3, and it's double attack to these pawns. There is no way for black to defend them both, and so you capture one of them right away, punishing black for the premature development of their light square bishop. Because very common tactics, so you definitely gotta know this. Besides the Queen's Gambit, there is also the second most classical chess opening, which is the Ruy Lopez opening that you can see right now on the board.